if we're not conscious that something was traumatic, but it was traumatic, does it affect how we tell a story?
I think so. Yeah, because this is where I think post-traumatic stress is helpful in the sense that it's sort of the quote unquote symptoms that one may experience or that reveal that something has been experienced as a trauma. So one might not call an event traumatic or even think of an event with the word trauma in mind, or even potentially remember in detail an event.
Hello, welcome back to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts and apparently trauma a lot, because I know this is probably my 4th or 5th episode on trauma, and it's not even the last one. I can tell you that in 3 weeks, there's another episode about trauma, and there's one that I won't mention now, but it's on the schedule to be discussed. Trauma is a pretty important part of our lives. It is a concept that I think we would do well to learn more about, even though we run the risk of maybe overusing the term, which is a concern that was brought up by Alexiana Fry in the very first episode where trauma was discussed. But when you consider how much space is given in biblical text to dealing with trauma and traumatic circumstances and developing a narrative that centers trauma or attempts to confront trauma, I don't think that this is something that we can overlook, particularly in a podcast about biblical studies. Pick up this book. It is not long. If I read it in a day, you can probably read it in a couple of hours. If you're an adult out there, given the inability that I have to focus for significant periods of time. And then the other books that are referenced or recommended, they're in the show notes. And then there's also a podcast episode that I'm adding. It's not about trauma, but it does cover some of what we've talked about with food. The podcast is called Women Who Went Before. It's a history podcast, or it's an ancient history podcast, but specifically the episode that I'll be linking in the show notes is Wearing Down the Body, Asceticism and Late Antique Monasticism. It's a pretty good lesson just about what asceticism is. I think it's a concept that was maybe a little bit deeper and broader than I thought in its origins, but then also just some of the ways that food and human bodies were a part of asceticism and obviously religious practice. I think they couple pretty well with the portions of our discussion here with food. I'm not going to belabor the introduction anymore. I appreciate you listening. If you don't want to listen to trauma, skip forward and you'll hear a preview of next week's episode with Troy Troftgruben. And other than that, if you want to reach out to me with guest suggestions, episode feedback, or maybe you just want a pen pal, a digital pen pal, you can reach me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. You can also follow the podcast or engage with the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Threads, Twitter, WordPress, Tumblr, a number of other places. Those are all free. Follow, subscribe, engage, give me feedback, whether it's on the podcast platform of your choice or on any of those social media networks, or if you want to take an additional step to support the podcast, you can also leave feedback if you become a supporter on Patreon for $5 a month. episodes come out early over there, and they are both audio and video for full episode releases. Okay. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sarah Emanuel. Take care. Sarah Emanuel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. My name is Sarah Emanuel. I am, I guess you could say, Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University. It technically doesn't become official until August, but I did get the letter a couple weeks ago. So I'll just say it. Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. I specialize in biblical studies, and I enter the world that is biblical studies in a variety of ways. I think what's really fun about studying the Bible is that the field is so diverse, and you can engage biblical texts from such a wide range of angles, and I enjoy doing so. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in asking questions about authors, about authorial intent, about original audiences, if we can know anything about original audiences for each text. But then I'm also interested in asking questions related to what some might call contemporary literary and cultural theory, which means I'm curious in asking what might we see or notice in a text if we implement a certain theoretical optic that we might miss if we don't use that optic. So for example, I do a lot with humor theory, do a lot with trauma theory, do a bit with queer theory. So I like to have fun with the biblical sources.
Okay. If I have your permission, I may just take that introduction and use that as my explanation for what the podcast is intended to be. Because, yeah, absolutely. There's so many different ways that you can engage. And yeah, so I'm doing for no pay and not as an academic what you just described. So I like that. We're off on the right start.
Great.
So, but specifically today, we're going to be discussing your book, Trauma Theory, Trauma Story, a narration of biblical studies and the world of trauma. So before we got going recording, you were mentioning kind of some caveats about the book and the series that it's within. Do you want to address that real quick?
Yeah, thank you. So this was an invited piece. That doesn't mean it didn't go through peer review. It still went through double-blind peer review. But I was asked to submit a piece on the relationship, really, between trauma studies and biblical studies for a specific series with Brill that's called Brill Research Perspectives in Biblical Interpretation. And in fact, when I was first invited to write this, it was, I think, in early 2018. Maybe even earlier, honestly, but I think 2018. It was originally described to me or published in a way that resembled more of a long article. This sort of research perspectives in biblical interpretation was first, just longer articles introducing readers to new critical optics, new ways of asking questions and engaging biblical texts. And then during my writing process, it switched from a long article to a short monograph series. So it's now published in the short monograph series. And the only reason I mention that is if you don't know it's for this very specific short monograph series that, again, is set up to introduce readers to new critical optics in and around biblical studies, you may think, oh, wow, this is so short. Why didn't she say more? Why didn't she explain things in more detail? It's because it's specifically for a short monograph series. And there's a specific page limit.
Fair enough. For my purposes, you're not in trouble. And I will say, at 42 years old, I can name the 3 books that I have read in a single day. Dave Barry's Big Trouble, Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos, and this book. I'm not good at reading. I enjoy doing it, but I get distracted easily. I pick them up, I put them down. I'll read a dozen or more books at once. But I might try to find another one so I can before the age of 44, I could say an average of once every 11 years, I read a book in one day. Okay.
Which another one of these research perspectives books, but
Yeah.
will also be short.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting read, and so you've already kind of set us up for this. But another author who is kind of contributing to the biblical studies trauma point of view, Alexiana Fry, I remember was my introduction to the term transdisciplinary. And the
Yeah.
first question I sent you is, would you walk through these different disciplines: psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and narrative, and more potentially, that contribute to trauma theory?
Yeah. Yeah. And I might describe the disciplines with slightly different categorization. But what I'll say basically, I think oftentimes when studying trauma and trauma theory, a starting point is psychology and psychiatry, namely because the sort of idea of what we call post traumatic stress disorder in detail sort of has its genesis in the 1980 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, um, uh, made by the American Psychiatric Association. So in the 1980 DSM-3, it's the third edition, we have for the first time a list of criteria that meets sort of the creator's idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I can just sort of in sum say what the DSM-3 says. It says the existence of a recognizable stressor that would evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost anyone is something that it calls PTSD, along with symptoms such as re-experiencing of the event, numbness, and hypervigilance. So this is produced by those in the psychology and psychiatric world, and from their studies of trauma and trauma theory sort of develop with varying nuances. And this is also related to neuroscience in the sense that those who are studying trauma and the effects of trauma, perhaps in particular, are also looking to things that happen in the body and in the brain. So, for example, scans show that if someone experiences an event as traumatic and then experiences what we call post-traumatic effects, such as numbness, hypervigilance, anxiety, re-experiencing of the event, as I mentioned. In those scans, the right side of the brain, which is the emotional side of the brain, will light up, and the left side of the brain, which is the linguistic side of the brain, will will dull. Okay, so there's real sort of brain responses to traumatic events and to memories of traumatic events. Also, various trauma imposes various strains upon the brain and the body, and our glands respond sort of in overdrive, which then can be seen in various PTSD responses. So, long story short, psychiatry and psychology are remarkably important for the study of trauma and trauma theory. It starts before 1980, but 1980 is often a major date that's named solely because that's when the DSM-3 for the first time states PTSD as this condition that persons can experience, and then that seeps into neuroscience in the sense that we might look to what happens in the brain in response to what one experiences as a trauma. So that's sort of one category that I think of together. I think of, psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience sort of in conversation very much with one another. But I'm speaking from, I'm thinking about trauma theory, yes, but I'm also putting it into conversation with biblical studies. And the Bible is a collection of stories. So that brings into that brings us into conversation with an additional I don't know, an additional field, you could say, which I think of as literary and cultural studies. Um, and that's not to say that these fields are necessarily distinct or fully bifurcated when studying trauma. And so this is where, you brought up narrative. This is where narrative comes in and also connects psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience with literary and cultural studies. So a metaphor that I often think about when imagining how trauma impacts one's sense of self, and one's brain and body. So I imagine our brains as encompassing a number of filing cabinets in which we organize our thoughts and experiences. And if one experiences an event as a trauma, what will happen is the way in which our brains have stored our lives gets disrupted, and various files within those filing cabinets, they might get moved to different cabinets, and you might get a little bit, you might feel a little bit disorganized. But if one experiences the trauma as remarkably significant, those files may not just get moved around; they might get taken out, ripped up, thrown on the floor, and one then experiences, deep confusion and distress in response to how they've perceived the world before, and then this profound disorganization of that of how they used to experience things, and how they used to see the world and perceive the world. And a common definition of trauma, which is often credited to a psychiatrist named Judith Herman, is that trauma is unspeakable. If one experiences an event as traumatic, it is so beyond the realm of what one once perceived as right and in the norm and okay, that there are no words with which to describe it. It escapes the bounds of narrative. And yet there's a deep paradox in trauma recovery, which is that in order to reorganize those files, in order to piece together that which has become so disruptive, it typically requires some kind of narrative. The unspeakable needs to be spoken. One needs to put words to the traumatic experiences and traumatic effects. And it's not a one-time deal, but it has to happen over and over and over and over again for one to slowly piece together a new sense of self, an understanding of what happened, and a new sense of self for moving forward, a sort of like a reconnection of one's self states, so to speak. Within that disruption of those filing cabinets, one's self states get disrupted as well. So one has to piece together one's sense of self, and narrative helps one do that. And so narrative in that sense connects psychology and psychiatry with literary and cultural studies, in the sense that both psychology and psychiatry will say, yeah, speaking the unspeakable will help one find themselves or reconnect their self states, and sort of lessen those PTSD responses. The brain and body will sort of regulate through processing of the traumatic event by way of narrative. But it also brings us to literary and cultural studies, which is, and also the Bible. And what I mean by that is, again, the Bible is a collection of stories, a collection of literature, taking place across a variety of cultural contexts. And one could read narrative, such as narratives within the biblical canons, in a couple of ways with regards to trauma. On the one hand, they could read these narratives as their own narrativized responses to traumatic events, right? A story can be an attempt to narrativize and respond to what one or a community has experienced as a trauma. Or a text could have within the story world a traumatic event occur and showcase characters responding to that traumatic event that is discussed within the story world. Or a text could do both. It could combine, it could sort of both respond to a trauma that has existed in the real world, and in responding to that trauma, create a narrative where characters are showcasing real responses to traumatic events that have happened. So yeah, I've named narrative, I've named psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. Was there another one that you posed? I'm not sure if sociology came up.
Yeah, that was in there So psychiatry and psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and narrative.
And
So
okay, yeah.
yeah,
So I can just say this one quickly.
take as long as you like. I'm not in a hurry.
Sociology comes in to really push us to remember that, on the one hand, yes, trauma is individual. Um, one person may experience an event as traumatic, and another person may experience that same event not as traumatic. And there are a variety of reasons for that to potentially happen. But also, communities can experience an event as a communal trauma. And so, sociology helps us think about the relationship between individual psychic pain and communal psychic pain, and how one sort of makes a claim. That's a common word that comes up in work on communal trauma. How one might individually make a claim that something has been experienced as a trauma, and then perhaps more complicated, how a community might make a claim that a collective has experienced some kind of collective psychic pain.
So there are several different ways to engage with biblical texts. People can use them as an individual for devotional readings,
Mm-hmm.
or they can be individual or collective in liturgical approaches, or just community identity through the narrative. So I guess I'm wondering, and I've read explanations, like I said, Alexiana Fry and others, but I guess I still have trouble with this because there is always the risk you run of taking modern concepts and applying them to um, ancient contexts that don't necessarily explicitly think in those terms. But so is trauma here like a scaffolding that's being used to help approach biblical text, or yeah, I'll stop there because I'll just keep rambling if I don't.
I guess I'm curious by what you mean by scaffolding.
Yeah, that's a so am I. That I guess, is it like an interpretive framework, or is trauma is it a term that's being applied within a different interpretive framework or model or scheme or paradigm?
Yeah, yeah.
I told you I'd keep rambling.
No, no, this is great. I'd say calling it an interpretive framework works quite well. And of course, with any modern interpretive framework, there are risks of missing the ancient authors and the ancient readers. That's not specific to implementing a lens of trauma. And, yeah, PTSD didn't enter our lexicon in the way that it has until 1980. That's remarkably modern. And yet, I would argue that in order for that definition of PTSD to even arise, studies before 1980 needed to occur. Experiences of profound psychic distress and dysregulation and responses to profound pain had to have happened. And something that yes, something that I think is helpful in thinking about ancient communities is, yes, they are living in a different world from us, and also they're human beings. And in the grand scheme of history, they're not they're not living that long ago. So it's a both and it's complicated. Um, there are always risks, and we may indeed be missing much from the worlds of ancient persons and the intents of these ancient authors. I don't think, though, that means we should stop asking these questions and or stop thinking seriously about the humanity of these ancient authors and the humanity of the stories that they're writing.
And I hope it doesn't come across like I'm trying to uh, gatekeep and say like, no, this is there's only. So by the time this comes out, listeners will have already heard. So a conversation with Yijia and Lin, and then I reference that with a conversation with Kyle Hughes. So he's talking about prosopological readings of biblical text, which was admittedly a challenge for me to get through, having grown up in a Protestant, just kind of subconsciously historical, critical, grammatical reading of biblical text, but she was very helpful in pointing out to me that people have engaged with biblical texts in the kind of ways that she's talking about in rewriting Hebrews 11:1 through, or 11 through 12:1. And that was very helpful for me that, okay, so if we're identifying that the objective here is to add another layer to our engagement with biblical text, in this case, an academic
Mhm.
approach that is taking in a modern concept, and that it's not bastardizing or adulterating the text at all, to just say, let's use everything we have at our disposal that may be a tradition, or that may be now this framework from the DSM. Is that a helpful way? Because if that's how I'm understanding it, if I'm not on the wrong, am I on the wrong track? I guess is
No,
what I'm
I don't
wondering.
think you're on the wrong track at all. It's just perhaps something that you're also getting at is, having humility in this, like recognizing and naming what we're doing. We are implementing a hermeneutic that could be trauma, could be something else, and just asking what we might see or notice within the text that we might miss otherwise. Might that reveal something about the ancient persons? Sure. Might it not? Sure. But that doesn't mean we should avoid asking more and more questions. And in fact, even more traditional academic approaches to the biblical text, which we in biblical studies call the historical critical method, even when asking questions of history, asking questions of authorial intent and implied audiences, we're still asking those questions as modern thinkers, and modern thinkers that have certain assumptions of history, modern thinkers that have certain assumptions of biblical antiquity, and even doing, ostensible history could actually be missing things about the ancient world. And so I don't want us to pretend that taking on a hermeneutic such as trauma is is missing something more than what perhaps a more traditional hermeneutic uh, might. I think that there are gaps in everything that we're doing simply for the fact that we are not the people in antiquity.
How do you? So, um, obviously, you were doing biblical studies before using trauma. I say obviously. Is that the case? I don't know why I said obviously.
Yes, although I would say one of my earliest interests happened to be trauma studies.
So, have there been things that since you've applied trauma, you've added additional things to your approach to studying biblical texts?
Yeah, so I mentioned before, another optic that I use a lot is humor theory. And feminist theory, queer theory, I post-colonial studies. I'm really open to exploring layered modes of meaning making or layered possibilities. And that comes in large part from my training. I was trained in a doctoral program that was very um, open to that kind of study. They trained us to know the traditional historical critical ways of engaging biblical texts, and to then offer additional approaches, and to put those in conversation with the more traditional modes of inquiry. So I I just like to ask questions. I'm not afraid of implementing a new optic. That doesn't mean that I don't care about the ancient world and what ancient persons felt and might have observed, and why they wrote what they did. I remain very interested in the ancient world. But again, I've always been curious about how other approaches might magnify or nuance or complicate, um, what we might ask or see about the ancient world.
I think so. I like to circle the drain on questions. So what I was circling there was actually, you kind of started addressing it. Do you think so? It's like you put down one overlay, and that's trauma, and you're kind of developing an understanding of the biblical text and its author or community of production, and then you put down humor theory.
Mhm.
Do you think, I guess, how would you characterize your development of your understanding or engagement with them? Because, and I ask because I kind of feel like the text as it is that I was raised to think with creates a remoteness, and it removes those people in those communities. Do you think that this draws you closer to them?
And are you saying you felt removed from the ancient persons?
Yeah, that
Okay.
that they were they were a conduit for a
Uh,
thing. It
Got it.
was produced, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah,
Do you,
yeah,
okay, I'll be quiet.
yeah. I follow. First of all, I often read trauma and humor as going together, especially when I do work in biblical studies. But yes, I do think that these lenses help us. I mean, it depends on how you ask the question. I should say that. So, for example, with trauma studies, and I'm so glad you continually reference Alexiana Fry's work. I think she does great work in the field of trauma,
And
and
she's just a wonderful person. She's
yeah,
just so nice.
she's lovely. I'm a huge fan, and I think she has also talked about this in the sense it depends on, again, what kinds of questions, for example, in and around trauma you're asking. Are you asking questions related to um, what event might this text be responding to that we know happened historically, or that the author is imagining happening, and how is the author responding to it, and is the author responding to it in a way that resembles um, what we might call post-traumatic stresses, or is the author explaining this event that signals that the author experienced this event as some sort of either individual or communal trauma? Is there something in the narrative that is signaling a traumatic event has occurred and the author is responding to it as such? If you ask that kind of question, yeah, you're going to get closer to antiquity. The question itself is positioning you within the ancient world and thinking about the ancient authors and ancient events and ancient communities responding to those events. But you could ask a different kind of question, or an additional question in and around trauma, which is related to the Bible's profound afterlife, related to how these biblical stories have been used and interpreted in a variety of communities well after the original authors and communities wrote them, and well after the original communities heard them or read them, if they were able to do so. Um, and the way in which the Bible has been used has sometimes, in and of itself, contributed to communal trauma. Folks have been told that the Bible means one thing or must be read in a certain way. And those meanings or those ways of interpretations have caused, in some instances, significant psychic stress. And so, in that sense, questions of trauma will take one away from the ancient world and more into interpretive history, or even all the way up to modernity. How has someone today perhaps been significantly impacted, perhaps even to the point of experiencing profound psychic stress, because of how the Bible has been used and interpreted?
Are the stories that we tell ourselves affected by our awareness of our trauma? Like, if we're not conscious that something was traumatic, but it was traumatic, does it affect how we tell a story?
I think so. Yeah. Because this is where I think post-traumatic stress is helpful, in the sense that it's sort of the quote unquote symptoms that one may experience, or that reveal that something has been experienced as a trauma. So one might not call an event traumatic, or even think of an event with the word trauma in mind, or even potentially remember in detail an event. But if they are experiencing some kind of suffering, some kind of disconnect of self state, some kind of anxiety, hypervigilance, re experiencing of something that they're not quite sure what it is, but something is happening, those effects or those symptoms will shine through in the way one operates in the world and in the way one tells a narrative. And even beyond that, I think our whole life stories contribute to how we view the world and how we relate to one another and how we narrativize our surroundings. So, in a grand scheme, the answer is yes, in the sense that I think anything and everything about us and our communities and our individual life experiences contribute to how we create our stories and tell our stories. And in a more, direct way, the answer is yes. Even if one doesn't define consciously an event as traumatic, it will still be, from the perspective of trauma studies, it will still be a trauma if certain after effects are happening in response to a particular event or series of events. Oftentimes trauma isn't akin to narrativizing trauma. The trauma itself isn't a one and done situation. One can experience multiple traumatic events, and the effects of that, conscious or not, will play out in one's life, including how one speaks and narrativizes their world.
And maybe how they eat.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just realized we've been talking for about 30 minutes, and I was like, I don't care if I have to shoehorn it in. I don't care
Oh, that
how
was great.
obtrusive it is.
It was
Uh,
good.
you talk a fair bit about food in the book, especially for a book this small. There's a lot in there. Yeah, you definitely got my brain going off in a lot of directions. Can we, even if it's the rest of the time we're talking, can we talk about food?
Absolutely.
I know that's not a very that's a very broad question, but I'm not sure I really fully wrap my brain around
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying, because sugar is delicious. I just gotta say that.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say the way in, and so I'll bring it in conversation directly with trauma studies. So food and trauma are often studied together. And I'll unpack this, I guess, as follows. Uh, the way a trauma impacts the brain and body so significantly, or at least it can impact the brain and body so significantly, that the responses to trauma infiltrate everything and anything. Trauma attaches onto thing after thing after thing after thing. So it's not just that one is anxious. Um, we have to ask, okay, what is one anxious about? And you could be anxious about something that consciously is very directed to a traumatic experience that happened. War veterans, for example, a loud bang, that could, one could be anxious about experiencing that again, or be hyper vigilant about loud bangs around them. But the anxiety, the stress, it tends to attach onto things even beyond what one might assume the trauma will attach onto. So one, can experience nightmares that are seemingly directly related to an event proper, and also not. And I mean, we can even go back to that example of a bang. I mean, a direct noise would be perhaps the sound of gunfire, but oftentimes it's loud bangs, even one slamming their hand down on a table. That's not the same sound as what perhaps a war veteran heard. It's a different sound coming from a different place, coming from a different body, and yet the effects of the trauma, the effects of the experiences attach onto all sorts of loud sounds. That's just one example. And oftentimes, in addition to anxiety or hypervigilance, or even a shutdown of one's surroundings, I haven't named dissociation yet. Dissociation is a very common response to trauma, which is related to sort of what I've said before, that disconnect between self states. But you can experience dissociation as sort of a deep numbness, or almost a blurriness. That disconnect between self states can feel like one's state of mind is remarkably blurred or detached from one's surroundings. All of these effects of trauma can occur and can impact one's day-to-day life and impact relationships, impact how one navigates the world, impact how one moves about in the world. I can't say it clearer than just trauma really attaches onto everything and anything in one's orbit, including how one eats. So on the one hand, we eat to feel better. This is sort of a common thing. We eat to connect with one another, to experience some kind of fellowship. We eat to, yeah, enjoy. Food is for many enjoyable, but we can also sort of perform our feelings by the way we eat and how we eat. Um, so we can perform our pains externally through a variety of means. Um, it's common, for example, for survivors of trauma to act out their pain, kind of show their pain if the access to narrative feels too painful or too far away, right? Speaking the unspeakable is remarkably difficult and painful. And so, if speaking the unspeakable feels too daunting or too inaccessible, in addition to having these effects of trauma by way of hypervigilance or anxiety, et cetera, we will showcase, we will perform some kind of distress in our actions, and that can include how we eat or our relationship with food. It becomes an external platform through which to showcase our pain. So, for example, it's common for those, even if one doesn't experience something as traumatic, but instead just a bad day, to have a pint of ice cream, just to cry and have that ice cream. That's a common image and a common thing that many of us do. And we could go to that pint of ice cream, sure, on the surface level to experience pleasure, to feel better, but also to disconnect from the pain proper. The pain proper can feel too much. And so we'll go to food to kind of detach. And in that detachment, you can go into further and further dissociation. And while that could be your individual response to pain, if one is watching it, if one is observing this happen, it's very clear to the observer that something about the eater's stress is being acted out here. Right? You may feel as if you're numbing yourself or disconnecting from the pain or trying to feel better in the moment as you're the eater. But I think it's easier to imagine how this is a performance of pain if you can imagine yourself as the observer of what's going on. If you observe this, you can feel that something that the consumer is in distress, is in pain. You might see them dissociate further and further from their own sense of self, and it will signal to you, okay, this is some kind of acting out of deep suffering.
And I don't know which one might have the worst reputation, but I know it's probably easy for people to be like, yeah, so and so's eating their feelings, but a substance abuse that we might think of, particularly if it's an illicit substance abuse, doesn't always get that same treatment. But my understanding of addiction is it's not the way I've heard it described. It's not the chemical hooks that there are people who are addicts to several different drugs and they'll do one drug. That just chemical hooks are not the thing. That it is linked to trauma in many cases, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think, yes, I think you're right that sometimes we miss the deeper, um, I guess, root of why people are acting in the way that they are, and yeah, and utilizing or acting things out by way of substance use in the way that they are. Yeah.
Are food and trauma represented? And I know the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, you're talking about different books and different perspectives, but are there, I guess, texts that you would point to respectively in each of those areas that kind of like this is a good representation of how food and trauma are in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, respectively?
Yeah, so the two that I look to, I mean, I really look to one in particular. I look to Ezekiel's eating habits or lack of eating habits at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is um, eating certain foods at certain times, and eating inedible food in the name of his God, thinking that this is what his God wants, and this is all in response to the Israelites doing wrong. It's sort of he's performing what he thinks his God sees as the Israelites' faults. So in the beginning chapters of Ezekiel, I think there's clear connection between trauma, pain, suffering. So Ezekiel and others in his community are experiencing the various waves of Babylonian exile. The Babylonians were responsible for plucking out Israelites in various waves in the 6th century BCE from their homeland, and then eventually destroying the Israelite temple. And so Ezekiel is responding to this and showcasing his deep grief and confusion and guilt and self-blame through this performance of eating and not eating. So I think that we see it surely in Ezekiel. But then another question that I ask, and I don't have a firm conclusion on this, it's just sort of, again, as I've mentioned, I enjoy asking questions and seeing where they might go. I certainly wonder if the evocation of Jesus in the New Testament of saying, eat this to remember my body, drink this to remember my blood, just before he's about to experience what some describe as the most painful way to die, which would be crucifixion. And crucifixion also included, public humiliation, public sexual humiliation as well. And, might that might that raising of food or bringing food into it and bringing some kind of ritualized enactment in and around food that is connected deeply to not just himself, but also what's about to happen to him, might something about food and trauma be going on here as well?
But it is kind of distinct in both of those cases. This is not like the pint of Ben and Jerry's. This is engaging with the trauma rather than trying to numb from the trauma, right?
Exactly. So that's a great point. So I would say the pint of ice cream example is just one example among many. And of course, one could respond to a traumatic event by way of not eating, by way of gaining some sort of sense of control or establishment, by way of setting up rules and regulations in or around food consumption, and that too could be some kind of performance of the trauma. But in doing those sort of actions in and around food related to a traumatic event, perhaps, I'm not saying all food consumption is related to trauma, but it can be. One can also be aware, especially if one is going through trauma recovery. As I've stated, narrativizing one's suffering, speaking the unspeakable, it's not a one and done process, and one will experience effects. Some might say forever, even if one, has reintegrated and kind of pieced together those files that have been shredded and has kind of connected their senses of self, one will never be the person that they were in a pre-trauma state. And so effects can still arise, and actions and enactments can still occur, and one can be aware, one can be more conscious of what's going on as it's happening. But I think you're getting to something even more. I think you're getting us back to the work of narrative, especially because when we're thinking about Ezekiel and we're thinking about Jesus, we have to remember that we're reading story. We're reading a narrative. We're not watching our friend act something out or perform something or do something. We're reading a story. And so these might be narratives attempting to say something, a narrative attempting to perhaps speak the unspeakable, to be conscious about the trauma surrounding them. And in narrativizing the unnarratable, one can showcase all the while the various pains and sufferings and effects of the trauma, even in the narration. And so I'm not sure if I'm explaining this well, but the book of Ezekiel is a book. And so Ezekiel as character may be acting out some kind of pain. And I mean, it seems quite clear in the text that, yeah, Ezekiel is acting out some kind of pain by way of what he's eating and what he's not eating, showcasing it as a representative of Israelite pain and suffering that the author thinks they deserve. But because an author is also writing this out, the author might be trying, it's unclear. Is the author unconscious of this, or is the author actually trying to say, hey, this is an acting out of something that is experienced as a great suffering? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it certainly got my brain going off in several directions. So I know for a fact, Suzanne Collins, who wrote The Hunger Games, was motivated by current events that she saw around her in the violence of that time, and that's where those stories came from. I don't know this, and I'm like 20 pages away from being done with the first book in the series. But Naomi Novik has this, I believe it's Scholomance, is how you pronounce it, series, and these kids, they're magical, and they're just put into the school. Like the day they're supposed to start, they pop into the school. They're on the top floor, and every year they get closer to the bottom. And there are like dark magical creatures that are trying to come in and eat them because they're drawn by their magic. I think very much, you talk about performance. This is performing, and I could be wrong. I haven't Googled it because I kind of don't want to burst this bubble. I have a son who's about to graduate from high school, and for pretty much the entire time he's been in school, I have felt terrified of an active shooter event happening to him. And I feel like she is showing us a story of children piled in. There are no adults. There are no teachers. The school is giving them assignments, and they are locked in, and they have to rely on themselves. And there is a corrupting competition that happens between them that pits them against one another when they should be protecting one another. And it's a bit of an indictment, because whether we mean to do it or not, this is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no more insane. I'm sorry, I know I get kind of rambly. I will wrap it up. There's a novel by Tim O'Brien called In the Nuclear Age, where a man is digging a bunker. So it's set during the Cold War, and he's digging a bunker, a bomb shelter, to keep him and his family safe, and his neighbors all think he's crazy. And seeing someone perform the trauma that everyone's living looks ridiculous. And that's so if my hopefully my response says yes, I think you are explaining it well to me, because that's what I'm latching onto in my brain with those. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Yes. Makes me feel better too.
Well, not those stories.
No. But it makes me feel like I was being perhaps clear. I mean, it's hard to talk about trauma. It's very, very hard. I mean, we're talking about something that is experienced as escaping understanding, escaping language, and yet trying to use language to explain it. So it's a very complicated thing to talk about.
I've brought this up before on the podcast. I I think I'm a fairly articulate person, but it is visceral, and that's all it is. The feeling when you hydroplane a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because of my experience in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, there is a visceral
Mm-hmm.
terror. When it rains hard enough here, I'm driving on the Beltway in Houston or surface roads, and my car just tugs a little bit. I'm not in mortal peril, but I am. Everything, all of my senses are telling me, no, this is terrible. It's the end. Sorry to be a bummer if I'm being a bummer.
No, you're explaining how this feels.
As best I can. And you're right. I do not have enough or adequate words
Mm-hmm.
to talk about that, to the point that when it's not happening, unless something makes me think of it, I'm not thinking about it.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on an hour. I want to make sure, I'd like to ask this question to cover all my bases. Was there something from the book you were hoping I would ask about that didn't come up today?
Oh, I mean, I already went there. And you asked it. I wanted to make clear that this was for a particular series that had a particular kind of page limit. So, yeah, that's sort of my insecurity about the book. People may pick it up thinking that I'm presenting it as if it's this full-fledged monograph, and it's not. It's short. It's meant to be a quick read. It's meant to be a starting introduction to trauma theory and how we might start to think about trauma theory in relation to biblical texts.
I mean, it's a fortunate coincidence, but I don't know if you could tell. So it's propped up against my collection of very short introductions,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
because that's where they are on the shelf. But that's, I think, if you look at the sources that are cited, and and so you read the book, you get a sense of what you're talking about, and then you take that as, okay, so here are some other places that I can go. Yeah, I don't. This seems like academic trauma that you got.
actually, I yes,
It's a tough life. You guys eat your own. I wish I could help with that, but I can't.
yeah.
Okay, so what would you recommend other than read this book and use it as a resource, as a springboard into understanding the subject? But what would you recommend to listeners to read, listen to, watch, etc., to get a
Yeah,
better understanding?
you named Alexiana Fry. I think Alexiana has a grasp on trauma and trauma theory in a way that is unique. In fact, when I read her work, I often think, yeah, she gets it in a really profound and nuanced way. So Alexiana Fry for sure. I'll name some thinkers outside of biblical studies, and then I'll bring us back to biblical studies. So I mentioned Judith Herman. Judith Herman's work is often, at the center of trauma studies. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, is often cited as well. Both of them are more in the psychiatry, psychology realm. Jeffrey Alexander thinks about communal trauma. So I recommend reading his work in relation to Judith Herman's and Bessel van der Kolk's. And then on the biblical study side, Alexiana Fry, Elizabeth Boaz, Daniel Smith Christopher, Nancy Bowen. Those are some names I recommend. There's currently an interesting conversation going on in trauma studies, and it's just at the start, I think. But Elizabeth Boaz has recently proposed that scholars of Bible who are wanting to implement a trauma hermeneutic be very concise and clear about whose theory of trauma they're implementing. So are you implementing a Judith Herman version of what trauma is? And if you are, be very clear in that and kind of stick to that. Or are you implementing a more communal trauma orientation? Are you thinking in the Jeffrey Alexander school of thought? And if so, say so and kind of apply that and don't get mixed up too much in the different approaches. And I think it's really easy to do trauma studies poorly. I think it's very easy to just go into the realm of, oh, this was hard and it can cause pain, and let's talk about that. And so what I think Elizabeth Boaz is getting at is, let's be more precise scholars here. Let's be clear about the theories that we're engaging and how we're engaging them, which I think is helpful. And at the same time, this is sort of where the conversation is going. I think thinkers like Alexiana and I are much more, we think about trauma, as I said, sort of attaches onto thing after thing after thing after thing. It refuses to be contained. It refuses to be so neatly categorized. And so she and I are much more open to naming the thinkers we're engaging and utilizing their various theories, but we're also really comfortable in sort of breaking boundaries and breaking categories, specifically because trauma breaks boundaries and breaks categories. So I just name this to kind of, put out there, if I think it's something that trauma scholars are going to be thinking about moving forward. How are we using these theories, and how precisely are we using different scholarly theories, and are we going to stick to one theory of trauma or kind of blend them to think about trauma? People will answer that question differently, but I'm just raising it here because I think that's where trauma studies in the biblical field is going right now, due to Boaz's, provocative and thought-provoking claims. And then the last thing I'll say is, what's interesting about the biblical scholars I've named here is they're all specialists in Hebrew Bible. We didn't really have time to talk about trauma in Hebrew Bible versus New Testament, but it is also something that I think those of us who implement trauma studies are thinking about. There is much more scholarship on trauma and sources within the Hebrew Bible than there are on trauma and sources within the New Testament. And I have some ideas as to why, but I'm not certain that they're accurate. It's definitely a question I'm asking right now. Why is trauma studies more attractive, perhaps, to those who study texts within the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and not in the New Testament? Something is going on there, and I'm curious about it.
I mean, so far, Alexiana, Rebecca Pohays, I have in my to read pile, is Hosea also among the traumatized? The Book of Hosea and Trauma Hermeneutics, which just came out in the most recent Journal of Biblical Literature. And yeah, there may be one or two other episodes about trauma, but yeah, they've all been pretty siloed into Hebrew Bible. So that is, yeah.
I mean, what's so curious about that is my mini monograph, engages predominantly the book of Ezekiel, but my expertise is more in New Testament. And so my first book is on the book of Revelation, and I very much engaged trauma studies in that book. But there's not many of us in the field of New Testament who engage trauma studies, certainly less than Hebrew Bible. And, I have to ask myself that question, like, why, when I was asked to write this book, did I end up focusing on Ezekiel and not something as much in the New Testament? Why did I do that? Curious.
I mean, I have some hypotheses as far as the New Testament. The joke I immediately thought of is like, well, yeah, they're all just trying to figure out what Paul is saying. Like, that's where most of the numbers go in New Testament studies. But I'll keep the other hypotheses to myself, and I'll just try to hunt down evidence of them. What do you read for fun?
Oh,
this is where I get most of you.
Yeah, oh no, this is a sad truth. I find myself not getting to read for fun. And in fact, I think academia some people really in academia, they long for non-academic books to read, and they just eat up, to use the metaphor, books for fun. Academia has made it harder for me to read for fun. I'm not sure why. I tend to, it's just, maybe I need a break, or maybe I've just gotten so used to reading a certain kind of prose style that it's gotten harder for me to read for fun. And I'm not happy about that.
Yeah. Well, then I encourage you to go and find alternatives if you're not happy about it. But I don't ask that to be judgmental. So I always have a backup plan. What do you do to decompress?
Oh, great question. I'm a gym rat. So when I moved to LA, I learned how to surf. I'm terrible at it, but I love to paddle out. And in COVID, I started to build my own home gym. So I've got a pretty awesome garage gym. I love to lift weights, run, row, cycle, all of it.
And you got visibly happy when you were answering that question. So again, no judgment on the reading. Read or don't read for fun, that's fine. You read a lot for work. But with the surfing thing, I like to tell my son, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. So it's okay. It's okay if you enjoy something, if you're just not good at it. Like I said, I enjoy reading, but I'm not good at that.
It sounds like you are, though, is the thing.
No, it's a war of attrition. I'm winning because I'm persistent.
Mm.
But whatever undiagnosed form of neurodivergence that I have, just I have trouble focusing. People will talk about how, like, oh, these cell phones are, they're ruining our attention span, and like, no, I've never been able to pay attention. So this is just, having a cell phone is just status quo for me. And even on that, going from one thing to another, it's my brain works fine that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's eventually taking a deep breath somewhere in my late 20s or early 30s and just saying, like, I'm not dysfunctional. I'm a functional adult. I can provide for my family. I think I'm a decent person. So I can just accept these things that have been a challenge in life. But no, I am not good at it. Again, I'm slow and unfocused. And most of the time, I don't know what's going on in something I'm reading until I get to the end. So unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Yeah, just thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Sarah Emanuel, take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe, follow the podcast, leave us feedback wherever you want to leave it. I listed all the places you could go at the beginning of the episode. Remember, $5 a month on Patreon gets you episodes early. It gets you full audio and video episodes. Next week on the podcast, Troy Troft-Rubin and I discuss his Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Time It Takes, Prolonged Pace in Luke's Travel Narrative, and that's focused on Luke 9:51 through 19:44. Here's a quick preview of my conversation with Troy Troft-Rubin, and if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Bye.
I've already talked about Luke's being one of a journey, travel, and it's one of following Jesus. And that's, I think, kind of the basic picture of what discipleship looks like. It's setting out on a journey, and there's no going back. And like any travel that we experience today, we go somewhere. At some level, we are changed. Unless we're thoroughly oblivious to what we go through and pay attention to nothing, it changes us. Our cultural worlds are challenged, our learning is informed, and the like. But to put in comparison to others, like it, whereas Matthew's is it's a portrayal, I think, of learning, discipleship in a more traditional or conventional kind of learning from the master teacher. Jesus is clearly a teacher in Matthew. And although there's an action reflection model to that teaching, the disciples are sent out, they're invited to step out of the boat, they're invited to do things as they learn. It's still clearly Jesus is the teacher par excellence, and the disciples are learners. So it takes a little bit more of a conventional kind of teaching learning portrayal, with Jesus being the master teacher. So kind of a Jesus as teacher and disciples as learners. Mark's gospel, I think, has the disciples as following Jesus rather blindly. Even by the end of the gospel, they don't necessarily understand fully or clearly who Jesus is, but they keep following until they abandon him, I guess, in the garden. But still, the general portrayal is of following Jesus, whether or not one fully understands. I think it's blind faith is kind of a good example to that. The disciples embody it to a degree, and yet there are others in the margins, women and others, that come around and see and understand Jesus more clearly. Despite whether one understands or not, there's a metaphor of following, different than travel, like in Luke, and of following blindly and trying one's best to understand and to keep following Jesus, who's faithful to them. Finally, John, I think it's a metaphor of question and answer dialogue with Jesus. We see it in people like the woman at the well, Nicodemus, Thomas, man born blind, who all engage Jesus in dialogue and ask some pressing questions, some skeptical questions. And they receive answers that are profound, that also invite them to a state of deeper faith, to make statements ultimately that are some of the greatest confessions of faith in John's gospel. So in short, I think, all these have really different kinds of emphases to what discipleship looks like. And it puts, I think it draws attention to the distinctiveness of Luke and the journey metaphor as a bit different than others.